Award-winning watches are usually pretty expensive. If you look at the 2023 GPHG Awards, for instance, the cheapest winner sells for well over $2,000, but not this watch. Now in this box is an award-winning Casio that you can grab for under £150 or $200, sometimes less. But what exactly is it, and is it worth buying? Well, today we're gonna find out, so stick with me. Here's how I found out about this acclaimed timepiece. As a watchaholic, I often check the Casio site to learn about the newest releases, and I saw a press release about 6 Casio products that had won prizes in the latest IF Design Awards. Now some of these were other Casio products like pianos and calculators, but there were also some watches in there. A mid-tier G-Shock, a luxury Frogman G-Shock, as well as this, the much more affordable A1100. Now I've been aware of this model since it released last year, and I initially overlooked it, lazily lobbing it in the same boat as the similarly styled A100, a plastic digital with a similar name that looked funky, but was perhaps a little garish for day-to-day usage. Clearly, the people in the know think differently. Indeed, the International Forum of Design, or IF, is a very prestigious German organization that hosts a competition each year where they assess around 11,000 products, with only a select few being chosen as winners. I've actually reviewed another IF winner before, the Sternglass Automatic, which I'll also link in the video description. That watch, it was quite the looker, so I was keen to see just what I'd missed out on with this Casio. So I bought one. Well, in fact, I bought 3, so we can take a look at each of the available colors. I'll have them all linked in the video description as well if you want to take a look. One thing I noticed before even handling the watch was price. Now, it may not cost as much as some of those other award winners, but the A1100 does cost a lot more than most chromed resin Casios, and that's primarily because it's not made of cheap plastic. No, this is one of very few Casio digitals actually made of stainless steel. The only others off the top of my head being the A1000, which I reviewed a couple of years back, and the recent limited edition Casiotron reissue, which cost a small fortune and sold out instantly. The plastic watches are great, cheap, easy wearers that you can destroy if you want to, but they're not so great for those after something with a more premium look and feel. This A1100 definitely feels much better constructed than the A100, but does it feel almost 100 quid better? Because yes, that's the premium you'll have to pay for one of these. Maybe. I mean, other watches are certainly built better at this price, but pretty much none of them are digital, so it's hard to draw a direct comparison. I think this watch would be awesome if it were below £100 or $100, at which point its weaknesses would be much easier to overlook. In fact, yeah, let's get those quickly out of the way first. The A1100 has a mediocre bracelet. It's less rudimentary than the metal bracelets fitted to the plastic watches, and it looks great with a lovely brushed finish. But at some point, it will pluck your arm hairs, as it still just uses folded links, as you can see from the back. It's also not very water resistant. Despite the fairly chunky rear, it's splash proof. And that's it. If you want to dunk this watch at any point, you'll have to keep your fingers and toes crossed. Maybe this is something to do with the way the pushes are arranged, I'm unsure, but not seeing at least 5 ATM is somewhat baffling. As long as you dip out of doing the dishes, the A1100 will look better for much longer than the plastic watches. The vertically brushed metal particularly suits digital designs like this, which are usually inhibited by the use of chromed plastic, so even from a distance, the A1100 immediately looks like a higher tier product. The finishing style also means there's finally a harmonious relationship between the case and bracelet, rather than a tug of war. Unsurprisingly, even from my limited time with the product, I noticed far fewer scratches and dinks than the plastic A100 or other plastic Casios. I tried the A100 for a similar duration last year and, well, it speaks for itself. The weight increase here also sidesteps the toy-like feeling that often accompanies these lower-end pieces. You do feel like you're holding something much more substantial. While it looks distinctive, the A1100 isn't altogether a new design. It's actually a reissue of the 52QS14B with some minor cosmetic alterations and a slight size bump. According to eBay listings, the original was 33mm wide with a 39mm lug-to-lug, while this one is 35mm and 40mm respectively. The original was also apparently only steel-plated resin, while this updated version, as we discussed, is fully steel, so it is heavier. Outside of that, the A1100 is very faithful in terms of appearance, with the same small display at the top and the pushers sitting beneath rather than protruding out the side like most digital watches. In some ways, this looks sleeker as it reduces the silhouette of the watch and means it can retain smooth, uninterrupted flanks that look akin to many analog watches. Functionally, These buttons aren't the best. They've got a larger travel distance than their appearance would have you believe, so you have to compress them pretty far to activate them, meaning there are often times where you feel like you've pressed, yet nothing has happened. From a practical standpoint, compared to side-mounted pushers, it's also harder to differentiate the buttons in the dark, and it can even be challenging to get used to their positioning at first because the indicators aren't super obvious. In fact, their respective functions are etched into the surface, meaning in certain lighting conditions, they just fade into the background, which I guess is kind of the point. You see, I'd say this is perhaps my favourite part of the whole design. It's an old school and stylish way of labelling functions without introducing more bright colours and distractions. The A1100 is far better looking than some other retro Casios for just this reason. It feels almost like operating your own mini control dial, with the front-mounted pushers forcing you to have more interaction with the watch. While I don't think it is the ultimate best-looking Casio digital, that honour goes to the super thin A700, it's a little like the girl next door. Quirky, but pretty in her own unique way. Its cleaner design has aged much better than the aforementioned A100, which is evident when you have them side by side. Sure, they're both boxy, but there's no chance that your friends mistake the A1100 for a fancy dress prop. Let's be real though, the A1100 hasn't won this award for its case finishing. Like most steel Casios, it's reasonable and serviceable from a distance, but in contrast with the fairly good brushing, the polishing is simplistic, and the case edges are far from the most precisely cut when viewed close up. Part of this could be down to their use of 304 steel, which is I think what they've gone for here, the same as is in some of their other steel watches. You can never get quite that same nice polishing as with 316L or even the higher end 904L. Still, I think it's the utilitarian steel covered expanse across the bottom half, contracting with the dark yet slim display atop, that provides somewhat of a unique yin-yang feel to this one. It's almost as if the time is peering out at you and not the other way around. It's definitely something that you feel like you'd see in the likes of Star Wars, and in fact there's even a model for Darth Vader here. Indeed, the black version with its matrix-like green accents and display could be found on the wrist of any number of sci-fi heroes or villains, while the gold version, well, that's just there for those after a touch of bling. When it comes to the on-wrist experience, I do think the A1100 could be thinner. At just shy of 9mm, it isn't a chunky watch, but the rear protrudes much more than it probably should, especially considering the poor aquatic performance and the slim diameter. This causes a small gap between the lugs and the rear, which could have been lessened if the watch was shaved down to around 7mm. It's worth noting that this one fits much larger than the sizing suggests. If you've ever tried a square or rectangular watch, you'll know that on-paper proportions can be deceiving. With the A1100, mainly because the lugs are extremely stubby, to the extent where they may as well be fully hooded, this 35mm watch wears much more like a traditional 39mm circular watch, which you might not expect when the watch arrives. For totally selfish reasons, I wish the watch was smaller. In fact, the size of the original vintage one, that would have been perfect for me. Nevertheless, it's still a viable size for most of you at home, despite feeling bigger than some of the most popular plastic models. The bracelet also has a more standard clasp design rather than the widely used slide clamp mechanism, which is great for tinkering, though I wish the holes were slightly closer together as the links here are very small themselves. While spec'd identically, I think it looks and wears slightly better than the previous steel Casio I reviewed, the A1000, with a more retro and masculine appearance, though there are some crucial differences worth mentioning, especially regarding the displays. The darker A1000 models all had that embarrassingly poor negative display that was completely unusable due to the dimness. Luckily, the black version of this newer A1100 has a peculiar green screen instead, which might not be perfect, but is slightly more legible. At certain angles, it still disappears, but at a far lower rate than the disastrous black one on the A1000. The nightlight also varies even just between these watches. Across the board, they're slightly dimmer than the standard display A1000 model, but are brighter than most of the plastic Casios. But the black and green version does boast slightly brighter performance for whatever reason. Unlike many of the cheaper acrylic-fitted alternatives, this one also uses mineral crystal, so it will hold up slightly better to scratches. While this is appreciated, we know from the similarly priced Casio Edifice models that Casio, they can do sapphire at this price, and they probably could have used that here instead, especially considering this is one of the, upper market digitals for them. Maybe it's because of the unique shape here that would have increased costs more. You can't just use a generic piece of sapphire crystal. Overall, I think this award-winning watch is very stylish and probably deserves the acclaim just for its cool appearance. Casio has also done a good job with the colorways. I'm actually unsure which I prefer of the three. That said, the underwhelming spec sheet and unnecessary unnecessarily protruding rear leave me feeling like the regular retail price is still too steep. I've seen these going for the equivalent of $200, I think about 170 something quid, which is way more than you should be paying even with inflation. For me, it's a perfect example of a watch you should try to grab at a discount from a grey market site if you like the look. I've got affiliate links to some of these sites in the video description if you're interested. Don't go blowing a fortune on this stylish but somewhat flawed digital.